It was the silence I remembered most, a silence that did not settle gently but pressed itself into the air with an odd insistence, as if it wished to be noticed. Oxford is rarely quiet even at dawn. The city is alive with the shuffle of bicycles and the impatient thrum of buses, but there are pockets, cloisters, forgotten quadrangles, where sound retreats and the world seems to lean inward. I had found myself in one such place on the morning the case began, though at the time it seemed unrelated, the kind of observation that passes through the mind and lingers without reason. I had gone, as I often did, to listen rather than to speak. The library was nearly empty, its lamps still faintly burning after the night, and the smell of old bindings carried a certain reassurance. I traced the spines with my fingers without interest in what I might read, and sat at a desk where some nameless scholar had abandoned a crossword. The clue was 7 letters, music-related, and for a time it gnawed at me with the peculiar insistence that only such trivialities can command. I left it blank. Even later, even after I had heard the news, it would still return to me in the oddest moments, a small emblem of incompletion. The news itself arrived in the most pedestrian of ways. A constable, rain still clinging to his coat, found me in the dim hall. He spoke in that low, careful manner reserved for delivering unpleasant facts, though I had not yet given him cause to believe I would take them badly. A death had been reported in the grounds of St. Frideswide's College. Suspicious, though not yet officially so. Would I come? I had walked those grounds many times in youth and later, and had never once felt their tranquillity disturbed. The college lay apart from the busier streets, its chapel tower pale against the grey sky, its lawns clipped into geometric obedience. Yet that morning, as I crossed beneath the archway, the air was oddly unsettled. Rain had stopped, but left behind a gleam that distorted the stones, as though the place had been subtly rearranged overnight. The body lay not in a room, but in the garden. A fellow, they said, though the name was spoken without conviction, as if uncertain whether he deserved the title. He was slumped against a bench, head tilted in a posture that suggested only weariness until the stillness grew unbearable. No sign of violence, no hurried disorder, merely absence. The sound of absence, I thought, returning to my earlier impression. Students watched from a distance, their whispers carrying further than they knew. A few dons stood together, their faces guarded, professional grief performed with practiced restraint. I observed them, not the corpse. A gesture caught me, the smallest twitch of a hand towards a cigarette case, withdrawn almost immediately when another eye met it. An instinctive motion, perhaps, but such things are seldom without significance. I crouched near the body, noting the faint smear of ink on the man's thumb, the unfinished sheet of paper tucked beneath his coat. The words were few, barely legible, as if abandoned mid-thought. Not suicide, I thought at once, though that was the whisper already forming among the watchers. Something had interrupted him. Something had arrived between his pen and its conclusion. The constable asked if I saw anything. I muttered something evasive, preferring not to share the small fragments already knitting together. To speak too soon is to risk dissolving them, like frost touched by a careless hand. Later, in the porter's lodge, I was offered tea. I barely touched it. My attention lingered on the register, left open on the counter, ink still glistening where a name had been entered earlier that morning. I read it, closed the book, and felt the odd certainty that it mattered. Not yet why, only that it did. Evening fell with a kind of merciless patience. I walked back through the streets, the bells tolling vespers, and felt again the pressure of that silence I had noticed at dawn. Oxford can be deafening with its chatter, but when it grows quiet one hears other things, the scrape of memory, the echo of things unsaid. It seemed to me then that the city itself was waiting, holding its breath, unwilling to disclose the rest of the story until I had earned it. And so it began, in stillness rather than noise, with absence rather than presence. A man, half forgotten already by those who had passed him in the cloisters, and a clue left unfinished on a crossword in the library. These were the threads. Thin, fragile, and yet, as I would come to learn, sufficient to bind the whole inescapable pattern. I have often thought that death, when it comes suddenly, is rarely sudden at all. It is prepared, rehearsed in fragments, the cough ignored, the letter left unsent, the unease dismissed as indigestion. Only later, when the body lies still, do the scattered signs coalesce. And so it seemed with the fellow at St. Friediswide's, whose death did not feel like an end, but rather the interruption of a sentence still waiting for its verb. The coroner's men had carried him away before dusk, leaving behind a bench and a patch of grass indented by wheels. The students had dispersed, their curiosity quickly diluted into gossip. Yet I lingered, unwilling to surrender the scene so easily to the mechanics of procedure. Absence still pressed against the place with a curious insistence, and I mistrusted the eagerness with which some called it natural causes. Nothing in the fellow's posture had suggested nature's calmness. He had been arrested. I walked the length of the garden again, slow, deliberate. Rainwater gathered in the grooves of the paving stones, small mirrors catching fragments of sky. There was an impression, though faint, almost fanciful, that a second set of feet had passed here in haste, the pattern not quite aligned with the ordinary traffic of the quad. I bent, traced the edge of a scuff near the bench, and thought of a man shifting impatiently, waiting for a meeting that had ended too soon. Inside, the porter offered explanations with an air of weary confidence. Heart failure, most likely. The man had looked tired for weeks, but then he added, with a hesitation that betrayed him, that the fellow had been expecting a visitor that morning, a former student, he believed. The register might show the name, though visitors were not always diligent in their entries. I asked him to bring the book once more, and there it lay, ink still too fresh to ignore Caroline Archer. The name hung oddly in my mind, neither common nor entirely unknown, like a tune half remembered. A visitor expected, a death deferred. The dons gathered later in the senior common room. I stood among them with the unease of one uninvited. The room smelled of tobacco and overboiled cabbage, the fire giving more smoke than heat. Conversation faltered when I entered, as it so often does when the police intrude upon the rituals of academe. One man, a thin, hawk-nosed tutor of philosophy, remarked that death in gardens had a certain classical dignity. Another, more pragmatic, asked when the rooms of the deceased would be sealed. Their detachment troubled me less than their precision. Each had rehearsed these lines before I arrived. I thought again of the paper found in the dead man's coat. A letter, perhaps, a sentence abandoned midway, words scratched but unfinished. I could not dismiss the possibility that its incompleteness was the truest clue of all he had been writing for someone, and that someone had arrived before he could finish. A death deferred, interrupted not by illness but by presence. Yet presence leaves traces, and I had not yet found enough to name them. I left the college late, the bells striking the hour with undue insistence. The streets were slick with rain, and the lamps cast their tired circles of yellow upon the cobbles. As I walked, I recalled again the crossword in the library, the 7-letter word that had eluded me. It came then, unbidden, and I almost laughed at the triviality of it. Cadence. The measure of rhythm, the rise and fall of a line. The fellow's death had its own cadence, unfinished, truncated, and it was in that stunted rhythm that meaning would eventually reveal itself. Back at home, I poured whiskey and sat without drinking. The glass reflected the lamp in amber distortions. Somewhere in the city, a woman named Caroline Archer was preparing her evening in ignorance or in dread. And I, with nothing more than a smudge of ink, a scuff in the garden path, and a half-written page, had already begun to hear the music of the case, though the notes were too faint to follow. Death had come, yes, but it had been delayed, postponed long enough to leave behind the whisper of intention. A death deferred is never an accident. It is an appointment rescheduled by unseen hands. Colleges have a way of folding in upon themselves, as if the walls were designed not merely to keep the city out, but to trap something within. St. Friddeswyde's was no exception. Once the great gate closed at dusk, the world beyond might as well have ceased to exist. Inside there was a rhythm, an order, as students retreating to their rooms, students hurrying in the rain with books clutched like contraband, porters standing watch in doorways where the shadows deepened. It was a closed world, and the dead fellow belonged entirely to it. I walked the corridors that evening with an odd unease. The stone was damp beneath my shoes, and the lamps gave off more shadow than light. A maid, young, indifferent, passed me, carrying a tray of plates. She did not meet my eye. Silence stretched, filled only by the muffled creak of my own footsteps. In such places one becomes acutely aware of being an outsider. Every whisper, every glance seems to acknowledge it. His rooms had been locked, though not yet sealed. The porter admitted me with a reluctant nod, as though he were delivering me into some confessional chamber. The fellow had lived simply, by academic standards. Books on every surface, a desk facing the window where the garden could be seen in pale outline, an empty whiskey bottle beside a stack of essays. Nothing spoke of violence, only an interruption. On the desk, the blotter bore the faint impression of words now absent from the page itself. I leaned close, tracing with my finger the ghost of his hand. Something about it resembled the half-completed crossword I had seen earlier, meaning waiting to be filled, but withheld at the last moment. I thought of Caroline Archer. Her name felt oddly at home in those rooms, though I had no evidence beyond instinct. Visitors to a cloistered world leave a greater mark than they intend. A word half erased, a book shifted by unfamiliar hands, even the faint scent of perfume clinging to a chair. I found nothing so definite, yet I remained convinced. Absence again, telling its story by what it withheld. Later in the hall, I joined the dons for dinner. Their talk floated above the clatter of cutlery exam scripts, funding appeals, some trivial scandal about a student seen after hours with a town girl. They spoke of the death, when they did at all, as though it had occurred in another century. One of them, a historian with spectacles clouded by steam from his soup, remarked that mortality had always been higher among men of letters. I asked what he meant, and he smiled in a way that revealed no humour. Excessive solitude, he said. Minds folded too tightly upon themselves. They collapse inward. I listened, pretending more interest in the food than I felt, but as the conversation circled, I noticed a curious omission. No one asked who had seen him last. No one inquired after the visitor's name. It was as though they had agreed, silently, to erase that portion of the day. And in their silence, I heard again the cadence of evasion, like a skipped bar in a piece of music. My deduction was small, almost fragile. The absence of a question can be louder than its answer. Someone among them already knew who had come to see him, and preferred it unspoken. Afterwards I stepped into the quad. The night air carried the faintest tang of smoke, perhaps from a chimney, perhaps not. Rain had begun again, soft at first, then heavier, and the sound of it striking the stone echoed as if from inside a hollow shell. I stood there, umbrella unopened, watching the windows flare and dim as lamps were extinguished one by one. Each square of light marked a life continuing in its private pattern, unbroken by the death that had passed among them. A closed world indeed. Yet within such walls, secrets cannot travel far. They circulate like air, breathed and rebreathed, until someone is forced to open a window. I left the college through the side gate, the porter locking it carefully behind me. As I stepped onto the empty street, I realized how completely the atmosphere of that place had enclosed me. The city outside felt insubstantial, lacking texture. Only the rain was real. And with it, the faint conviction, almost a whisper, that the fellow had not died alone in his garden. Someone had stood close enough to leave nothing but absence behind. A closed world keeps its own counsel, but it cannot silence the echo of unfinished words. Whispers travel faster than facts in Oxford. By the time I returned to St. Frieswide's the next morning, the college had already rehearsed its narrative. The fellow had been unwell, overworked, perhaps drinking more than was wise. Heart failure, they murmured, a sad inevitability. It was the ease with which they spoke those words that unsettled me, as though they had agreed upon them in advance, a consensus reached not from truth, but from necessity. I walked the cloisters slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps echo against the stone. A pair of students passed, lowering their voices as they noticed me. I caught only fragments of a woman's name, laughter sharpened by unease. They glanced back once, as if afraid I might have heard too much. It was not Caroline's name, though, another woman. The fellow had not been solitary in his attachments. That fact, more than anything, disturbed the tidy narrative the dons had prepared. In the porter's lodge, I asked casually whether Miss Archer had been seen leaving the previous day. The porter hesitated, fiddling with his keys, then said only that she had departed before the rain began. I doubted him, if only because the rain had been intermittent, coming in fits and starts, and his certainty seemed rehearsed. Truth is rarely so neatly timed. I let it pass, but stored it carefully in that part of the mind where inconsistencies gather like fallen leaves. Later, over a reluctant cup of tea in the senior common room, I heard the first true whisper. A tutor of literature, greying at the temples, leaned towards me and asked whether it was true that the dead man had been preparing to resign his fellowship. I told him I had heard no such thing. He seemed disappointed, almost relieved, and added that certain quarrels over a manuscript had been making the rounds. Whispers again, motives wrapped not in money but in words. In Oxford, manuscripts carry more weight than banknotes, and envy is often bound in leather. That afternoon, I visited the fellow's rooms once more. The desk remained much as I had left it. On the shelf above, I noticed a volume displaced, thinner than its neighbours, as though handled more recently. A collection of verse, marked in pencil with annotations that did not match the fellow's hand. I traced one note, an obscure reference to Ovid, circled twice. Whose hand had written it? A student, a colleague, or the visitor whose presence everyone was in such pains to smooth away? It was a minor clue, almost laughably slight, yet it sang in its own quiet key. Someone had argued with him not in words, spoken aloud, but in the margins of poetry. In the evening, I dined alone in a pub off the high street. Rain lashed against the windows, and the city outside blurred into streaks of grey. A man at the next table spoke loudly of money lost on a horse, his voice grating in its certitude. I thought of the dons again, their calm rehearsals of cause and effect. Certitude is always suspicious. The truth, when it appears, arrives hesitantly, as though uncertain of its welcome. Only lies stride in with confidence. Walking back through the drizzle, I found myself puzzling over a crossword clue torn from the day's paper, blown against the curb. 6 letters motive. The answer, of course, was reason. But as I stared at it, I felt the faint chill of irony. The reason in the world I inhabited was never so simple. Men kill not for reason, but for whispers, for pride, jealousy, the unbearable weight of a word left unsaid. Motives, like the voices in the cloisters, arrive half-hidden, their outlines blurred by rain. When I reached home, I set the page upon my desk and let the word linger there. Reason. It seemed inadequate for the case at hand. There was no reason yet, only shadows of desire, fragments of quarrel, and the quiet insistence of absence. A man had died, interrupted in the act of writing. Until I understood for whom he had been writing, the motives would remain whispers, scattered by the wind but never silenced. There is a peculiar satisfaction in being misled. One pretends to resent it, to frown at the wasted hours, but in truth a red herring can be a kind of relief. It reassures us that the world still contains enough mystery to evade the net, that truth is not always obedient to our expectations. The case at St. Friediswide's offered me my first such misdirection on a morning soaked with drizzle, when the lawns of the college looked like green cloths pressed flat by some giant's hand. The porter, with that mix of officiousness and curiosity common to his breed, told me he had remembered something. A man had been seen near the fellow's rooms not long before the death, tall, broad, badly shaven, not the sort of figure to belong naturally to a cloister. His presence had struck more than one observer as out of place. The porter relayed it with relish, confident he was providing me with the very lever that would lift the case from uncertainty to clarity. I thanked him without enthusiasm, though inwardly I felt the same tremor of excitement. We are all vulnerable to the lure of a figure who does not belong. I found the witness, a kitchen boy, no older than 17, who confirmed the sighting. He had seen the stranger pacing near the gate, then disappearing into the cloisters as if he knew where he was going. When I pressed him for detail, he frowned and added something that at first I overlooked. The man had carried a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. The boy could not remember the title, but he was certain of the gesture, the way the paper had been pressed against his side like a shield. Later, that small detail would strike me as the only part worth keeping. For now, though, I followed the lead with uncharacteristic haste. I spent the better part of the day in pubs that ringed the college, listening to half-drunk tales and staring too long at men whose only crime was being ill-shaven. In one place, the King's Arms, a barman told me of a man who matched the description, loud-voiced, eager to quarrel, with a habit of scribbling in the margins of his paper. He had left without paying his bill. I let myself believe for a short while that I was closing in on the shape of a murderer. But when I returned to the college and laid out what little I had gathered, the dons exchanged glances that cooled my enthusiasm. One of them, a mathematician with an air of dry precision, remarked that the fellow had recently been involved in a dispute over gambling debts, an unsavoury matter best left outside the college walls. The stranger might have been a creditor and came to press his claim. A sordid business, hardly the stuff of tragedy. It was said so smoothly, so deliberately, that I almost allowed myself to be carried along by it. Yet something in the cadence jarred. The dons wanted the matter resolved too quickly, as though eager to fasten blame upon a figure who did not belong. And I recalled again the newspaper pressed under the stranger's arm. It was not debt, I thought, that carried him into those cloisters. It was information, words, not money. The herring gleamed redder the more closely I examined it. That night I sat by my desk and filled in a crossword from the day's Times. One clue, 7 letters imposter. The answer, naturally, was pretense. I wrote it in then stared at the word until the ink blurred. Pretense. The case, as it stood, was pretending to be something it was not. A quarrel about debts, a stranger in the cloisters, a convenient explanation to silence uncomfortable questions. All of it fit too neatly, like a crossword solved too soon. And crosswords solved too soon are always wrong. I slept badly. Rain rattled against the window, and the city outside smelled of damp stone and decay. Somewhere, I felt sure, the real thread had slipped just beyond my grasp. The red herring swam brightly before me, its scales reflecting every answer I wished to find. But already, beneath the surface, another shadow stirred, quieter, subtler, and infinitely more dangerous. There are sounds in Oxford one never notices until they are absent. The bells, for instance. Their cadence has long been woven into the fabric of my days, marking time with a discipline far sterner than any wristwatch. That evening, however, it was not their absence, but their hesitation that caught me. The bell at St. Friddeswyde's faltered once before resuming its measured toll, as though the rope that drew it down had resisted for a fraction longer than expected. A small thing of no consequence to most. Yet I have always mistrusted hesitations. I climbed the narrow stairs into the tower at dusk when the college had begun to empty itself into the hall. The stone steps spiraled tightly, damp beneath my hand. At the top, the chamber was cold, filled with the smell of rope fibres and dust long undisturbed. The bell rope dangled in its place, frayed at the knot where many hands had pulled, its fibres roughened by years of calloused fingers. But there was something else, a faint indentation in the dust near the pulley, as though someone had stood there too recently. I crouched, touched it, and came away with grit clinging to my skin. No porter had been here that day, no ringer had been scheduled. So who? From the tower window the garden lay below, its geometry blurred by the half-light. The bench where the fellow had died seemed an afterthought, a solitary mark upon the symmetry. I imagined the rope pulled at the hour of his death, the bell's voice spilling across the cloisters, announcing his departure before it was known. A fanciful thought, perhaps, yet Oxford thrives on such echoes. Bells have always marked transitions, birth, marriage, the end. Why not this? Descending, I encountered the verger, a man of nervous disposition who seemed startled by my questions. He assured me the bells were rung only on Sundays and special occasions. When I pressed, he admitted reluctantly that the dead fellow had once kept a key to the tower. For solitude, he said. He liked the silence there. But silence is never complete in such places. The rope hangs, waiting, and a man's hand, even idly, might test it. I wondered how many times he had stood where I had stood, listening to the hollow heart of the college beat above him. That night, back in my room, I turned over the faint clue again. A disturbed patch of dust, a hesitation in a bell, a key in the possession of a man now dead. Did it mean anything? Or was I, like so many before me, seduced by Oxford's capacity to embroider meaning where none existed? I poured whisky, though I drank little of it, and let the thought remain unresolved. In some cases, uncertainty is its own form of truth. As the clock edged towards midnight, I opened the crossword from that morning's paper. One clue lingered on the rope's end, 5 letters. I stared at it for longer than I should have, until the answer slid into place almost mockingly. Noose. A word heavy with implication, yet offered here as mere wordplay. I filled it in, my hand unsteady, and felt the faint unease of synchronicity. Words and things too often conspire, and one is left wondering which came first, the clue or the crime. Sleep did not come easily. Outside, the rain resumed its patient tapping, and the city folded itself into darkness. The bell did not toll again that night, though in memory I kept hearing it, a faltering note, an uncertain voice echoing across the stone. And beneath it all, the whisper of rope fibres strained too tightly, too suddenly by a hand, whose presence no one wished to acknowledge. If the first red herring had glimmered with the crude brightness of a stranger in the cloisters, the second came dressed in finer clothes, subtle enough to seduce even my own mistrust. It arrived, as these things so often do, not through revelation, but through gossip, that soft, insidious murmur which winds its way through the colleges until it hardens into something resembling fact. The story was simple. The fellow had been seen in the company of a woman not long before his death, and not the woman whose name lingered on the porter's register. Another. A figure more entangled in the college's inner life than Miss Archer could ever be. The dons spoke of it as though they wished the words to stain the air and remain there, fixed and immutable. An affair, whispered the mathematician, with a thin smile. An indiscretion. The implication of hung shame can kill as effectively as a blow to the head. I pretended to listen without interest. Yet the more they spoke, the more plausible it seemed. Oxford is not immune to the ordinary dramas of the heart. In fact, it magnifies them, trapping them within walls too narrow for secrets to remain contained. A clandestine meeting, an argument in the rain, a sudden collapse of the heart. Yes, it had the neatness of a story that wished to be believed, and still something in me resisted. That evening I returned to the dead man's rooms unannounced. The key, I noticed, had been used recently. The lock bore the faintest scrape, newer than the others. Inside, the desk remained as before, but a single sheet had been moved from beneath the blotter. I compared the position to what I had seen on my earlier visit. I am cursed with a memory for such things, and the difference was plain. Someone had returned, perhaps seeking to reinforce the narrative of an affair. But the room resisted. It offered me no scent of perfume, no trace of hair or discarded trinket. Only silence. A silence too carefully arranged. In the senior common room I asked a question I already knew would disturb them. Had any of them seen him in company that week? A pause followed, long enough for the truth to enter before the words were spoken. At last, one of them nodded. Yes, in the gardens at dusk, a woman with dark hair. He could not say who. Another confirmed it, though his tone lacked conviction. They were building a ghost between them, shaping it to fit the outline of guilt they desired. I let them speak, but I did not write it down. The deduction, when it came, was not dramatic. I sat later with the crossword and encountered a 4-letter clue, 4 letters, false trail. The answer, inevitably, was ruse. I wrote it quickly, almost angrily, as though the puzzle mocked me with its transparency. Ruse. That was what I had been offered, draped in the costume of scandal. It would satisfy the dons, no doubt. They could dismiss the fellow's death as the unfortunate coda to a private folly. But I had learned long ago that truth seldom arrives dressed in scandal. It slips in quietly, unnoticed, while others quarrel over appearances. Walking back across the quad, I paused beneath the chapel tower. The bell rope swayed faintly in the draught, though no wind stirred the air. I felt, absurdly, that it was gesturing, pointing towards something I had missed. The garden below lay dark, but I could picture the bench, the still body, the half-written page. He had not been writing to a lover. Of that I was suddenly, inexplicably sure. He had been writing something else entirely, something that demanded interruption. The red herring, then, was not in the story of the woman, but in the eagerness with which it had been told. They wanted me to believe it. They wanted me to close the book before it was finished, but I could not. I have never been good at leaving crosswords half-completed nor lives cut short without their reasons, and so I walked on, rain beginning once more, against the stone, with the uncomfortable certainty that I was being led further into a labyrinth where the exits were designed not to be found. The library at St. Fritzwide's is not the grandest in Oxford, but it carries a certain severity. The long tables polished by generations of elbows, the high shelves where dust lingers, despite the efforts of keepers, the peculiar scent of vellum and damp that clings like incense. It was there, amid the hush of turning pages, that the case gave me its next fragment. A fragment disguised not as revelation, but as memory fixed in silver salt. I had not gone in search of it. My purpose, if one could dignify it with that word, was only to sit among the books and allow the weight of them to press against my thoughts. A librarian, pale and fastidious, regarded me with the suspicion reserved for those who enter with motives other than scholarship. I ignored him, settling at a table near the window where rain traced thin veins down the glass. It was there I noticed the album, a leather-bound relic left upon a side shelf, the kind of object that usually survives only because no one thinks to destroy it. I opened it idly, expecting benefactors and cricket 11s. Instead, I found photographs of fellows and their students, posed in the stiff formality of decades past. The faces gazed out, blurred slightly at the edges, their identities preserved in careful script beneath each image. I turned page after page without interest until one arrested me. The dead man, younger, seated with a group of students, among them a woman. Not Miss Archer, but someone else, dark-haired, serious, her eyes fixed not upon the camera, but upon him. It was the gaze that unsettled me, intimate without touching. I traced the ink beneath, Caroline Archer. The name, written then, stared back with the innocence of record-keeping. A student once, long before she returned, as a visitor. It explained something, though not enough. Her name in the register had seemed an intrusion, belonging neither wholly inside nor outside the college. Now I saw the thread she had belonged to once, and perhaps still claimed to. I recalled the Don's eagerness to supply another woman, another scandal. Was this why? To distract from the fact that Caroline had always been part of their closed world? That her silence since the death might mean more than any whispered affair? The librarian approached, asked if I sought anything in particular. I shook my head, closing the album gently. His eyes lingered on it, then on me, as if to measure how much I had gleaned. He said nothing more, but his retreating steps creaked with an eloquence of their own. Silence can be a form of complicity. Later in my room, I laid the crossword beside the memory of the photograph. 1 clue, 6 letters, to look back. I considered it, and the answer emerged with disquieting ease: reflect. That was what I had been forced to do, to reflect not only upon the image, but upon what it suggested. The photograph was not proof, not even evidence. Yet it was a reminder that the dead man's world had always been entwined with hers, long before whispers and red herrings. And reflection, though passive, can be dangerous. It shows us not only what was there, but what we failed to notice. That evening I walked the cloisters again, the album's image fixed in my mind. I imagined her sitting across from him in the garden, the years collapsed between them, words passing that no register would ever record. Did she leave before the rain, as the porter claimed, or had she remained until the silence fell? The photograph offered no answer. It only told me that her presence was not coincidence, that history has a way of intruding upon the present with the quiet persistence of dust in old libraries. I returned the album the next day, leaving it exactly where I had found it, No one would suspect it had been opened, yet I carried its weight with me, heavier than any tome. A photograph is not the truth, only a captured moment. But sometimes a captured moment is enough to unseat the lies that grow too easily in its absence. Oxford has always been a city of quotation. One cannot walk through its cloisters without hearing some fragment of Latin, some shard of poetry, borrowed and polished until its original sense is obscured. But it is not the words faithfully recalled that linger with me, it is the words half forgotten, mangled in recollection, their sense bent into something unintended. Misquotations reveal more of a speaker than the text itself. Memory, after all, is less a record than a confession. It was with this in mind that I listened, late one afternoon, to the dons in their common room. The fire hissed in the grate, smoke curling like a veil, and the talk turned, as it inevitably did, to the fellow's last days. One of them, the philosopher with the hawk nose, remarked that he had overheard him quoting Ovid in the garden. He recited the line with solemn gravity, but I knew at once that it was wrong. The Latin twisted into nonsense, a word misplaced, a metre broken. The man had either misheard or misremembered. Yet when I asked quietly whether he was sure of the phrasing, he stiffened, defensive, insisting that the memory was clear. I let him be, but my mind held on. Misquotation, I thought, is never accidental. It is the memory choosing what it can bear. Later, as rain rattled against the tall windows, I asked the librarian whether the dead fellow had borrowed Ovid recently. He hesitated, then admitted that the volume was indeed among his last requests. He had not returned it. I asked to see the register, and there it was, his name inscribed, the date marked only days before his death. No one else had borrowed it since. I ran my finger along the page, noticing a faint smudge beside his signature, as though his hand had trembled with ink still wet. Did he stumble over Ovid's line, or had another voice misquoted him deliberately, reshaping his final days into a narrative that suited their purposes? Back in my room, I opened the crossword, and the clue that faced me was 6 letters of false memory. The answer, once teased out, was delude. How apt! To delude oneself with misquotation, to substitute memory for truth until they are indistinguishable. It struck me then that the dons were engaged in precisely this act, rehearsing his last words, his last movements, until they became convenient, bearable, a fiction hardened into fact. What they remembered was less the man than their need for him to be forgotten. But Caroline Archer lingered at the edge of my thoughts. I had yet to hear her speak of him, though her silence echoed more loudly than their chatter. When at last I sought her, she received me in a small lodging near Jericho, the rooms spare, its walls yellowed by time. She offered tea with hands that shook slightly, though whether from age or fear I could not tell. When I asked about her visit, she admitted it without hesitation. She had come to see him, yes. He had written to her after years of silence, asking her to call. But when I pressed for what passed between them, she faltered, her words dissolving into fragments. A few remarks about the past, a poem he had misremembered, and then nothing. She trailed off, unwilling or unable to continue. Misquotation again, but this time of the heart. She remembered him as she wished to, and the gaps in her account were louder than the words she managed to speak. I left her lodging with more uncertainty than I had entered. Memory, I thought, is treacherous. Each witness offers a version, each version shaped less by fact than by desire. And yet in the contradictions, a faint outline began to form, like ink bleeding through thin paper. If the philosopher had misquoted Ovid, perhaps deliberately, and if she had stumbled in her account, What lay between their distortions? A line half remembered, a silence too carefully arranged, these might prove truer than anything spoken aloud. That night, alone with whiskey, and the crossword folded upon my desk, I thought again of the answer I had written earlier. Delude. The word stared back at me, accusing, as though to suggest that I too was not immune to the comforts of misremembering. Perhaps I wanted to believe in the neatness of patterns, the cadence of deduction. But truth in Oxford is rarely neat. It comes fractured, misquoted, hidden in the slips of memory. And if I were to find it, I would need to listen less to what was said and more to the silences between the words. There are moments when Oxford seems to breathe against one's ear, whispering secrets not meant to be heard. That evening, as I stood beneath the tower of St. Frideswide's, the bells remained still. Yet their absence was louder than their toll. The silence pressed down on the quad like a hand, and I felt it in my chest, a rhythm suspended, waiting. Death, I thought, has its own cadence, and in this case the beat had faltered. I had returned, restless, unable to shake the sense that the tower contained more than rope and iron. The steps were slick with damp, and each turn of the stair echoed with a hollowness that seemed older than stone. When I reached the chamber, the rope hung unmoving, frayed as before. But the dust that ringed the floor had changed. A faint line, scarcely visible, suggested movement since my last visit, a foot dragged perhaps, or the careful sweep of a hand brushing away its trace. Someone had been here, and recently. I crouched, running my finger through the dust, and tasted again that mingling of absence and presence which haunted the case. Silence, disturbed by the smallest gestures. From the window the garden stretched below, wet grass catching the glow of the lamps. The bench where he had been found looked ordinary now, a place for reading, for solitude. But I could not banish the image of him slumped there, ink on his hand, words unfinished. What had he heard in his final hour? A toll of the bell? A silence more eloquent than sound? The thought clung to me as stubbornly as the smell of rope fibres on my hands. Later I sought Caroline once more. She seemed weary of me, yet resigned. Her voice was thin, carrying only fragments. He had written, yes, he had spoken of the past, of verses half remembered, of the tolling of bells at matins that had once comforted him. But when she tried to repeat his words, she faltered, misquoting as before. The line she offered was not Ovid, not even close. I corrected her quietly, though I doubted she heard me. She was wrapped in her own silence, a silence that protected her as much as it condemned. It was not what she said, but what she withheld, that mattered, and I left her room with the impression that she too had stood beneath the tower, listening for a bell that did not sound. That night, at my desk, I unfolded the crossword again. A clue stared at me, 5 letters, soundless. The answer came easily mute. I wrote it in, my pen pressing too hard, the ink bleeding through. Mute. It seemed the only word for the case as it stood a death written in whispers, a college conspiring with its own silence, a bell rope touched, yet refusing to speak. Evidence did not shout, it lingered in hesitations, in dust disturbed by an unacknowledged step, in misquoted lines that revealed more than truth would dare. I poured whiskey, but did not drink it. The glass caught the lamplight, amber deepening into shadow. I thought of the Dons, rehearsing their memories into fictions. I thought of Caroline, shaping hers into omissions. And I thought of the man himself, leaving behind a letter unfinished, a cadence broken. Each had paid a toll, but not in coins, in silence. Silence was the price exacted by this closed world, as merciless as any bell summoning the faithful to prayer. Outside the rain ceased, and the city held its breath. For a long time I sat listening, half expecting the bell to sound, to break the night with its weight of iron. It did not. The tower remained mute, complicit in its own secrecy. And I knew then that the toll I waited for would never come from stone or rope, but from the voices I had yet to corner, from the silences I must force to break. Until then, Oxford itself seemed suspended, as if unwilling to resume its rhythm until the truth was spoken aloud. The case had not reached its cadence. It lingered in the pause between notes, the silent toll that resounded more deeply than sound itself. And in that pause I heard the faint stirrings of an answer, not yet clear, but inevitable. Silence cannot last forever. Even in Oxford, there are silences that soothe, and there are silences that accuse. Oxford is built upon the former hush of libraries, the quiet cloisters where learning seems to distill itself into the stone. But what I felt in those days at St. Fried's Wides was of the other kind, a silence heavy enough to press the breath from one's chest. Not absence of sound, but sound withheld, a weight. The dons still performed their routines, but their eyes betrayed them. Conversations faltered when I entered a room. Laughter dwindled to murmurs. They had all agreed tacitly to carry their portion of the quiet, as if it were some burden to be borne communally. Yet, when a silence is shared, it does not lighten. It multiplies. I recall one evening, late, walking the length of the cloister where rain tapped against the leaded windows. A student passed me, his gown soaked at the hem. He greeted me with politeness, but I noticed the pause, the momentary hesitation, before his eyes met mine. He had been told not to speak, though he longed to. Silence enforced is never perfect. It leaks through gestures, through glances. That hesitation told me more than words might have. The fellow's rooms remained sealed, though I persuaded the porter to let me in once more. Dust had begun to gather, but not evenly. On the mantel lay a faint patch cleared by a sleeve or hand, the outline irregular. Someone had entered since my last visit. They had touched nothing of consequence, yet their presence was undeniable. I stooped, brushed the mantle with my palm, and felt the faintest grain of grit cling to my skin. What was sought? A letter? A photograph? Or merely reassurance that nothing incriminating remained? On the desk, beneath the blotter, I found a slip I had missed before. Not words this time, but numbers, half a column of figures scrawled in haste, as though copied from somewhere else. College accounts? Gambling sums? Their meaning eluded me, but one detail struck the hand differently. The fellow's writing, I knew, was precise, almost priggish. This was rough, hurried. Another's hand in his room, leaving its trace upon the page. A silence again, but written in numbers rather than words. That night I returned home, restless. I unfolded the crossword, needing the discipline of clues and answers to steady me. One read 7 letters burden carried. I puzzled for a while until the answer revealed itself. Silence. I wrote it in, though uneasily, as though the puzzle mocked me by offering truth too directly. Silence as a burden, yes, the dons carried it, the students carried it, and now so did I. I poured whiskey, but left it untouched. The rain outside had eased, leaving the city slick and shining. In the stillness I considered what I had gathered. Caroline's hesitations, the don's eagerness to misquote, the student's glance, the disturbed dust. Each was nothing in itself, but together they formed a kind of weight, not yet evidence, not yet conclusion, but the pressure of something unspoken pressing towards speech. The following morning I spoke again with the porter. I asked if he had ever known the fellow to climb the tower, to linger by the bells. He nodded reluctantly. For the silence, he said. He liked the quiet up there. I thought of the dust disturbed in that chamber, the rope that had faltered, the silent toll that had not sounded. The fellow had gone there for silence, and perhaps found more of it than he wished. The weight of it had followed him into the garden, where it crushed him at last. I cannot say I knew then what had happened. I only knew that silence had been chosen, imposed, and rehearsed. It hung over the college like the air before a storm, and I, unwilling though I was, had been given the task of breaking it. For silence may endure for a time, but it cannot last. Its very weight ensures it must fall, sooner or later, into sound.